Again, I'm Marla Riekman. I am a soil management specialist with Manitoba Agriculture. My job really is to focus on extension and support, mostly in the area of crop management, although I do deal with forage and livestock as well, specifically to the area of soil. And so when I give a soil pit, there's usually a lot of people standing around me, and this time I'm just not in the hole. Sometimes maybe this is a good thing. There have been times when I have been standing inside a hole, one time actually, when the hole was dug immediately before the soil pit presentation started, and the backhoe operator sat in the cab waiting and watching me from above until I was finally scrambled out of the pit so he could fill it back in again. And I have to say, that was probably the most nerve-wracking soil pit presentation I've ever given, most likely even more nerve-wracking than this idea of doing it remotely. Specifically because if I said anything wrong, it was very easy to dig me back into the hole. So what we're looking at in the screen, what you're looking at in person, is an orthic dark brown Chernozems. This is the soil that's been dug on site. And there's a few things that I want to point out as we go along. Anybody who's there in person, you can be going through the pit and seeing some of the stakes that have been put out by Jamie in advance. And so I will be kind of tying to the number of those stakes as we go through, just to kind of keep on track with my thoughts and with the pit presentation. But I don't know how many of you get a chance to look at a soil pit. Soil pits can be pretty awesome to go see, especially for soil nerds like me. Not a lot of times do people get a chance to actually dig down and take a good look at the soil below. And I find that a lot of farmers and agronomists are quite fascinated when they can get into a soil pit and start seeing certain things pointed out. So to get started, just to set the stage in terms of what we're looking at, the soil pit is somewhere around that line where the yellow star is. I just pulled this up on the Alberta Soil Viewer, showing that this is an orthic dark brown Chernozems. It's medium textured soil, so it's going to be in that loam to silty clay loam, depending on where we are within this polygon. And it may be overlying a clay or some kind of finer textured till below. And again, I can't get in there and actually physically texture the soil, so anyone who's there in person, go ahead and pick them up. And, if you got a water bottle, pour a little water on it and squish it around a little bit, and you can get a feel for what soil texture we might be dealing with. The other information from this viewer that I can find is that the slope is quite low. It's a 2% generally slope. So it's a flatter landscape, but there are some rego profiles. And rego meaning that it has a lot of either eroded topsoil or loss of topsoil at the surface. And won't have a B horizon in those cases quite often, mostly because they're young soils. They haven't developed necessarily as well. So those would typically be higher in the soil profile. And just because this is a Chernozemic soil, Chernozemic soils generally are soils found in the prairie grassland region. So you can see this on the map, looking at where that kind of ugly green, it looks like kind of khaki green color on my screen. That's the extent of the Chernozemic soil. So typically developed under grasslands, they have to have an A horizon at least 10 centimeters thick, or if that A horizon has been plowed in the past or cultivated in the past, it needs to be 15 centimeters or 6 inches thick. And so that's an indication of a Chernozem. Again, Chernozems developed under grasses, which means they have a very thick A horizon because that extensive root system under the grasses helped to develop that high organic matter material in that A horizon. If you think of a grassland, a prairie grassland, most of the biomass is below ground. If you compare that to a luvasolic soil, which is that faint yellow color that we see as you move further north, that's under forested soils. And in a forested situation, the majority of the biomass in a forest is above ground. So you have less of an A-horizon development, so less topsoil in general. So these Chernozemic soils, very deep topsoil, because again, they were developed on grasses. This is a comparison. So this is an orthic black Chernozem. You are looking at an orthic dark brown Chernozem. Dark brown meaning in the dark brown soil zone. Orthic meaning typical. So orthic, it shows the very typical kind of textbook conditions that create a Chernozem. So this is the Newdale clay loam. I put this up because it's a very similar comparison to what you are looking at in the pit there. But the Newdale, other than the fact that this is the provincial soil of Manitoba, so it's a bit special to us, it is an orthic black Chernozem, so again, developed under grassland situations. It's on a glacial till. You can see a bit of kind of stones and rocks kind of down deeper into that C horizon and BC horizon. We can see them at the surface as well. There's one kind of central there in the A horizon. But you've got that dark brown surface, you've got a transition into that B horizon. So over time, water has moved down, leached out some of the organic material from the A horizon to darken up the soil below it, which is how you get that brown B, and then transitions down into, in this case, the CK, because there's high lime and high calcium carbonate in this particular soil profile. One thing I want you to take note of in the pit you're in, and as well on this photo, is that A horizon has a very straight line. I remember years ago being taught when I worked for a chem company, and it was about looking at different things that you can identify as problems in a field. And my boss at the time said, nothing in nature is straight. And it resonated with me as I started moving into working in soils, as you see, a straight line is not natural. And so this is why we would consider this to be a AP horizon. So it's a plowed layer where from continuous years of plowing, the surface soil has been mixed in with the B horizon below, and that's where you get that very straight line from. You'll note at the pit that you're in, it's straight whether you're on the perennial side or the annual side. You can also note on this photo that there are these little tongues or lines of dark soil that move down from the A horizon. That's going to be cracks that have opened up in the soil, roots that have grown down and over time decayed and allowed for either topsoil to move down into the profile, or through that process of dying and decaying have started to build organic matter in those little channels down below. So this is what naturally that A horizon will look like. We'll have more of that kind of wavy effect to it, but once it's been altered by human activity, you get that plow layer, so you get that very straight line showing up. Looking at it as an example, it's hard to see on the photo on the right, more so on the photo of the left, you can see a little bit more of that varied A horizon. And that's another orthic black Chernozem. In this case, you can also see that there is in around that 20 to 30, even 40 centimeter mark. There is a lot of a blocky soil structure. So you can see it almost looks like bricks that are built on top of each other. If you can imagine Lego bricks kind of stacking on top of each other. And that blocky structure generally comes from the development under the prairie grassland soils, again, where you have freeze-thaw effects. So freezing and thawing will cause usually the more horizontal cracks, and then the vertical cracks will show up more because of wetting and drying. So the shrinking and swelling of the clay content in that soil is developing these kind of blocky structures. So if you pick away at the soil where you are, you can actually start looking at it and seeing if you see specific structures that give an indication of development. So blocky structures are good structures. They actually allow for water to move down because there's cracks and spaces for water to move. At the surface, if you pick up surface soil, you'll find usually more granular soil structures, so rounder soil structures, again, are also good for water movement because they allow for a lot of downward water movement. So The next thing that I wanted to point out, moving on to, I guess this would be the stake that's labeled number 2, is the color of the soil. Now, this soil, because when I looked it up on the Alberta Soil Viewer, it says that it has a classification of a 4M, which means that it is moisture limited, and it is not, as a 4, it shouldn't be quite as productive as, say, a class 2 or a class 3. Here in Manitoba, where we use a slightly different rating system, I would assume that a soil like this should not show any mottling or rust stains at depth, because I would assume that this soil has much more rapid water movement through it as a sandier soil, where water just kind of moves through quickly, and that means it's well drained. But if you can go and look down a little bit deeper into the soil profile, and if you see that there are any stains, rust spots, you pick them away and you can actually see these rust stains, this is actually an indication of a soil that has imperfect drainage. So a well-drained soil will have a well-developed A horizon and a B horizon, and you won't typically see down deeper in the soil profile any of these rust stains. But if you have the red rustings or mottles, they indicate fluctuating water table. So it means it's a soil that has a water table that rises and then lowers over time. And what happens is, just like if you have a nail that you leave lying out in the elements, it will rust. But it doesn't rust because it has air, it's exposed to air. It rusts because it's exposed to both humidity or moisture as well as air. So you need the moisture as part of it to cause that rust stain. And so with the soil, when you have the water table come up and then go back down again, you have this intermittent wetting and then drying, and that allows those rust stains to show up. If we were digging a pit near a wetland or somewhere where the soil is very poorly drained, say on a heavy clay with very poor drainage, in that case, you might not actually see the rust stains. You may just dig down and see a very dull gray color, or even a blue or a greeny gray color to the soil. And that's an indication that the iron that is in the soil is always reduced. It's always underwater. So it never actually shows the rust. And you can see that on the photo on the bottom left corner. This is a soil aggregate that when it was pulled apart, like on the outside of it, you can see the rust stains where the soil hasn't been allowed to dry a little bit. But on the inside of this aggregate, water it's just always wet. There's never any air. And so when it was popped open, you could actually see that blue-gray color and no rust in that case at all. So we use information about drainage quite often in the case of just better understanding, I guess, how water is moving through that soil. So again, I mentioned that you'd have a well-drained soil with an A, a well-developed B, and a C horizon. And in that case, if it's well-drained, and I'll talk about salts in a little bit, the salts will be very deep down in the soil profile. They won't come up that high because water doesn't typically move up in that environment. Whereas when you have an imperfectly drained soil, so a soil that may show that presence of mottles, the salts actually get trapped in that soil profile because of downward and upward movement over time. The salts get a little closer to the surface. Where you have a very poorly drained soil where water is always near the surface, or at least coming upwards around, say, those wetlands, that's where you find salts at the soil surface. That is an indication, again, of discharge or poorly drained soils, upward water movement, dragging salts along with them. This last of the 4 columns here, the last column is actually showing how if you have a soil that has had the drainage change, so this is what we call secondary salinity, where you have, say, a soil along a roadside, a soil that was typically well drained. So over 10,000 years of soil development, you have an A horizon, you have a well-developed B horizon, you have a nice, the C horizon deeper down, having carbonates deep in the soil profile, which means that over time, water has moved downwards in the soil profile, but because of some kind of man-made event, like, say, the building of a drain alongside or a roadside ditch, the hydrology or the water movement of that soil has changed, and it's brought the salts along with it. So the soil was developed under well-drained conditions, but the drainage changed, so the salts came up. But you still have a profile with that well-developed B that looks like the well-developed profile on the left. It's just that something has happened more recently in the development or management of that soil caused the salinity to change. And that will affect how we manage salinity, and we can talk about that later if you have questions. One last note on soil structure. I indicated we were talking about granular structures and blocky structures being good for downward water movement. If you are in a soil and you see a platy structure, and in the center of this photo, you can kind of see an area where there are kind of plate-like structures or flat pieces. In that case, when water hits that area, it has to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to move around all of those plates. Platy structures can come along with compacted soils. So when we compact soils, if you have a plow layer, 6 to 8 inches down below the soil surface, if you dig away there, sometimes you will actually see the indication of platiness developing in that area. And that is not only meaning that roots can't explore that area as easily, but it affects how water moves down through that profile if that soil does get compacted, or if you have even a natural platy structure. So you can have kind of a forced platy structure from, again, years of compaction, or you can also have natural platy structures that can develop in the soil as well. So that can impact water movement, downward water movement, as well as upward. Okay, the next thing for stake number 3 and 4 is to talk about the roots that we see. So on the grassland side, obviously the roots are going to be probably showing up quite a bit deeper. This is a very generic graph that a lot of people have kind of pulled up online, where it shows the general rooting structure of native prairie grasses and forbs and such that would have been found in kind of the native prairie. And it gives an interesting indication, I guess, to me in terms of the different root architecture that you see from plant to plant. It is one of the things that people most complain about when they talk about monocultures in terms of roots, that a monoculture only has one root style. But part of the reason why we develop proper crop rotations is then to have, even though the crop we grow in one year is a monoculture, we're changing the root architecture from year to year depending on what crop we're growing. You don't want to just grow a fibrous root system year after year after year. You want to mix that up with taproot systems. And so that's a part of kind of creating the variability in general. I pulled this up from Joel Ransom, NDSU, had a presentation that was online specifically because I believe you've got peas there. And it just shows that in general, under the research period, they were looking at 95 to 97. The peas were rooting, on average 1.5 feet, but the maximum depth they would find the peas was down to about 3.5 feet. A lot of times I find that people don't always realize how much of the root biomass there is compared to the above ground biomass. We often talk about it being, half above and half below ground. But the roots of the peas, if you start looking at them and finding them, you'll find that they're quite a bit deeper maybe than you're expecting them to be, based on how big the pea plant is so far. If you get a chance to go out and start digging and looking at the root development of a very young crop, obviously the crops, it needs to photosynthesize, it needs to actually have leaf matter in order to start taking up, building sugars and stuff to be able to grow, but it really needs to have a very strong root system below it to access nutrients and water in order to support that above ground growth. And so, you know, I did my master's research looking at rooting depths of canola. Easily was rooting 4 feet on average, even though this site only said that it was, you know, average rooting about 2 feet. We were finding easy 4-foot depth canola as well as wheat. Sunflowers are very deep rooted, and quite often why people use sunflowers to use up a lot of moisture is because they tap down and take up a lot of moisture. But crop roots are quite a bit deeper and quite a bit more extensive quite often, especially with our annual crops, than we expect them to be. So just wanted to point that out. There's also an indication from roots of a problem. So if you have a problem like compaction, which is showing up in this series of photos that I have here, the roots are going to be something that gives you an indication of a problem. I highly encourage people to own a very smart tool when it comes to compaction and understanding compaction, and that is not a penetrometer, it is a shovel. They don't cost that much. It is easy to have and carry around. Everybody should have a shovel in the back of the truck that is being utilized to scout fields. If you are seeing issues, start digging, start looking down below you. But the biggest thing about the shovel is that if you've got a plow pan, you're going to know you got it because you have to dig through it. There have been many times when I have been in a farmer's field and they say, oh, no, I don't have a compaction problem. So I hand them the shovel, like, you dig then, and you tell me if you have a compaction problem. So a shovel is your best friend to investigate. In this case, we were in a soil pit on a very naturally compacted soil. And you can see here my hand on the photo on the left. I'm actually pulling away a chunk of soil, and behind that chunk is what we were exposing was on the photo on the right. So in this, maybe kind of hard to tell, but this root system is not exploring the soil fully. It is growing on a plain or in a flat area, and it's growing in the one crack that it could find. Roots are going to do great things for you to help whittle away and work away at soil, but they can't do all the work. If you think about a freshly poured pad of concrete, you don't have weeds or things growing in it, but you get that crack on the side of the sidewalk. And once that crack is exposed, right away you've got quackgrass and other weeds that start growing in that crack. And because now that the roots have exploited the space that was left for them, they start to whittle away and exude acids and start breaking it down, and that crack gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time, and that concrete starts to weather. So if you compare that to a compacted soil, the root kind of needs that space to be created for them in some cases first. So they're going to exploit the crack, and then they're going to start working away and whittling away at breaking this up. But they're going to first, as you see in these photos, find that crack and only grow in that space because that's the easiest space for them to grow in. And I have heard this many times about things like tillage radish. Tillage radish is a very strong taproot. It has a fair bit of pressure that it can push down into the ground to try to break through some of those compacted areas, but they cannot do everything. If the soil is that compacted, it will impact the ability for even something like tillage radish or some of these strong taproots to grow through. So this is a radish that we dug up on a compacted soil that grew every which way but down. And you can see that one root that did eventually go down, it found itself an old crack and then kind of drilled down or pushed down into that crack. But otherwise, this radish was not going downwards, it was going outwards. And then one last thing on compaction is the other above ground indicator. So in this case, this is a plant that looks like, this corn plant looks like it has a phosphorus deficiency. And if you did a tissue test on this, it would tell you that yes, indeed, the plant is phosphorus deficient. The thing is, though, that if you did a soil test, you would find that there is adequate phosphorus in this soil. What's happening is that the root at this earlier stage of growth, the plant is very developed or very dependent on that phosphorus to get going, and the root is inhibited under the ground. the root isn't able to explore the soil, therefore the plant can't find that extra phosphorus to take up. So sometimes you will even see this with phosphorus deficiencies or other micronutrient deficiencies that exist where the soil test says there's plenty available. It is the inability for the root to explore the soil that is causing the problem. Okay. Moving on to other things that we can see in the soil pit. Now, it's kind of hard to see this here, but Jamie had sent some more blown up photos of some white deposits that she was finding deeper down in the soil. So there's a couple things that might be going on here. If you are finding, as you dig up, you find some little white chunks or white spots in the soil, quite often they can be calcium sulfate. And this often looks a little bit more crystalline in nature in terms of what that, if you break it up, you kind of see it somewhat has a more crystallized kind of form to it. So that's normally when you're seeing calcium sulfate, we'll find that. There's also other white deposits that, because I'm not there, it's kind of hard to be able to tell exactly what it is. But if you're picking around and you see these, because it has more lines to it almost, it can sometimes look as if you're looking at like old root spaces or channels moving down through the soil. This is more likely calcium carbonate. And that would be more powdery in nature. So that's free lime that has been moving through the soil up and down in those cracks, again, with water movement, that may have deposited on the edges of the soils as it goes along. But again, I'm not there, so it's a best guess for me because I haven't been able to kind of pick away at it and take a look. But if it seems a bit more powdery, then that could be a calcium carbonate or a limestone deposit. This would show up on a soil test if you do have higher lime soils or free lime in your soil. So this kind of semi-dissolved powder, calcium carbonate in the soil. This will show up on your soil test as CCE, so calcium carbonate equivalent. And that, again, it's an indication of how much free lime you have in the soil. If people were ever looking at trying, like here in Manitoba, when we're dealing typically with higher pH soils, if you're trying to acidify a soil, the free lime or the CCE is the buffering capacity. So you have to add enough acidifying agent, whatever you're using, in order to first counteract the free lime in the soil before you can actually start lowering the soil pH itself. So that might be some of the white deposits. The other white stuff that we quite often talk about on the prairies is the salinity that's around. And in this case, I say this anytime I give a salinity talk. I've been trying to teach my own dad for years to stop calling it alkali. It's not alkali. And the reason why, especially for people in Alberta, to be able to delineate between the two is alkali is a sodic soil. That's a soil that has a high sodium problem. Alkali is called such because it usually has a very high pH, so a pH in the 8.5 range, whereas the white stuff on the surface is actually just salt. And so salinity or saline soils are different than alkali soils. The management of those two soils are very different as well, which is why I'm always trying to make sure that people aren't calling the white stuff alkali, because then they may actually mismanage and make a decision if they're Googling, how do I deal with soil that's alkali, and you get suggestions to add gypsum or calcium or magnesium products to the soil, and that's not going to fix a salinity problem. That is going to fix an alkali problem, which again is a sodium problem and not related to salinity. The salinity comes and goes with wet and dry years. I don't want to keep talking about it as I see that our time is starting to dwindle a bit here, but as you go through these wet and dry cycles, typically where we see the salinity get worse is after we've gone through wet years and we start going through a drying period. At that point, then the salinity will get worse. In terms of salinity effects on crops, a lot of the crops like wheat and canola have a lot of salinity tolerance. They can actually tolerate into those mild or kind of mild to medium salinity areas. things like barley, rye, oats have pretty decent tolerance. Where we in Manitoba are concerned when we see salinity is where we're dealing with an increase in soybean and corn acres. As we have more of that on saline soils, crops like soybean and corn do not do well in terms of salinity. And so those yields will peter out quite quickly. And lastly, I just wanted to go through this question here because quite often we talk about soil health and different ways that we can kind of manage or monitor with soil health. Is this soil pit that we're looking at, is this a healthy soil? How can we even tell? And there's a few things that we can look at here to try to determine if it's a healthy soil, but the biggest thing for me when it comes to something soil health is it is all relative to some degree of what it is that you are trying to get out of your soil. So in this case, you know, we've got a good soil with a thick A horizon, nice profile. It looks like it's got some nice granular soil structures going on at the surface. If you've got good drainage through this soil, that is helpful. It means good things. I love this graph that Kaylee Gash from NDSU created. Andrew McGuire modified it a little bit from Washington State University. And the biggest things to ask yourself about your soil, if you're trying to figure out if your soil is healthy, does it blow or flow away? Yes or no? Does it allow water to soak in quickly? Yes or no? Does it drain? Yes or no? Does it crust? Yes or no? Does your crop recover most of the nutrients that you're applying? Yes or no? And are there areas where plants die or grow poorly? And depending on how you've answered these questions, it is either probably healthy or probably not healthy. And the reason why you say probably is, again, it's all very relative to what it is that you're trying to accomplish with that soil. And it's not always a very easy, soil health is very much in the area of shades of gray. There isn't a lot of black and white unless your soil is all blowing away or all flowing away very badly. And you're seeing a lot of that heavy erosion. Sometimes that could be a bit more black and white. But again, a lot of it is shades of gray because there's so many different aspects to soil health. We've seen a lot of this happening in Manitoba recently. We've got these dry springs where it's been very, very windy. And depending on the management of the soil, where we have seen a little bit more exposure of tillage, especially high-speed shallow tillage, we're starting to see a little bit more of those fields having high risk of wind erosion. And just to wrap up, because I'm talking about tillage, I can't not talk about this part. The active tillage erosion itself. So we set up one of these demonstrations last year in Lacombe for Canola Palooza, where we did this with peas. This specifically is from Carmen, Manitoba, on a bit of a slope where the blue line in the center was actually a trench that we cut and then filled with corn seed. And then we either went down the slope or up the slope in the direction of the arrows with a tandem disc, cultivator, and high-speed disc. We did 2 passes to see exactly how far we could actually move the corn that was in the trench. The corn became an indicator of soil movement because you can't actually tell how far one piece of soil traveled. And the X's on here, the yellow X's, are the farthest that I was able to find corn seed at the soil surface after we traveled over. So this slope is about 60 meters in length. So we were getting, 30 meters in length. So we were finding things, 10 to 12 meters from its original point. And then a few weeks later, we actually saw, as the corn started to grow and emerge, that in general, on every single one of these, whether we were going uphill or downhill, with every single piece of equipment, we went at least almost at 14, 15 meters with each pass. We were able to find some corn that was growing further down the field. And another side note on this one, when we talk about tillage erosion, is if you're concerned about spreading soil-borne diseases like clubroot, this is as far as a patch can move from year to year as we go through it. So when we go through in one direction and then cross back in the other direction, we don't move that soil back to where it came. We just spread it now in two different directions. So another thing to think about. So with that, I will stop talking and see if anybody has any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Marla? Oh, we do have one question that just came in, and it says, do you think the adoption of high-speed shallow tillage was the result of the wet years?
Yeah, so we saw, so Manitoba's experience with vertical till first, and I would call it vertical till first, and then moving into high-speed shallow tillage, which is not truly vertical. We saw that coming in quite heavily in 2012 following the 2011 flood, where people were dealing with wet soils, typically on no-till land with heavy thatch and residue to deal with, trying to dry out the soil. And really the purpose was, again, just to chop in size or cut up some of that residue and open things up. It was very quickly widely adopted, I would say. I have a, how do I put this? I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to vertical tillage and high-speed discs. Vertical till can actually do a great job of cutting and sizing residue, and where you're dealing with high residue, heavy residue fields, so where we're dealing with things like corn and such, we think of vertical till or shallow tillage with the high-speed disc as being conservation tillage because it's not so deep. The problem is it is not so conservation when you start seeing the soil fly behind. And so a lot of the speed at which that machine is going through the soil or across the soil, it is eroding soil faster or to a greater degree than slower, deeper tillage. My big thing with vertical till, when people own these implements, yes, they make a beautiful seed bed. I know why people love them. But if you're prepping that seed bed the fall before, you're leaving that soil at higher risk for that wind erosion in the spring because it doesn't leave a lumpy surface. And a lumpy surface actually slows down wind movement over the surface of the soil. So when you have that beautiful pulverized soil and this nice seed bed left behind, it's easier because it's nice and smooth for that soil to actually blow in those spring winds. So my concern is when people use that very expensive piece of equipment on every acre every year. I think it's best used targeted to very specific residue situations where you have heavier residue you're trying to deal with. I don't want it to be used on every acre every year because we are starting to see a new plow pan form at 2 inches on some fields where that's the only piece of tillage equipment that goes over the field anymore. So it's becoming the new plow in that way. The plow pan was created from years and years and years of 6-inch depth plowing, and now we've got this 2-inch depth high-speed disking that actually can create a plow pan even higher, like at that 2-inch depth. So that is a concern of mine for sure. So I'd like to see people think more, if they are incorporating tillage, to rotating the tillage based on the need with the crop residue they're dealing with and not use the same implement every acre every year.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Marla. And if everyone here wants to join me in giving her a big round of applause, I'm sure she can hear us.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, sorry we can't be there in person, but glad we were able to make do.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good rest of the day.
You as well.